How'd you get off the boat at all? You know it doesn't stop here again for 4 weeks, don't you?
Sure I do. Think I'm overjoyed about it? But it's just got to be, that's all.
Hollywood's golden age gave us some of the most iconic films ever made, and some of the most scandalous private lives ever lived. Behind those perfectly lit close-ups and tailored studio portraits, the biggest stars of the era were living by a very different script than the one they handed audiences. Today, we're counting down 11 golden age Hollywood stars who slept with everyone. Number 11, Clark Gable. He was called the King of Hollywood, and he wore that crown with a certain reckless confidence that extended well beyond the silver screen. Clark Gable was born in Cadiz, Ohio in 1901, and long before he was Rhett Butler or the toast of MGM, he was a struggling young actor using every tool at his disposal to climb the ladder. In those early years in New York, Gable worked what people later called a stage gigolo circuit, befriending wealthy, older, well-connected women in theater circles who could open doors for him. Actress Pauline Frederick, who was 18 years his senior, gave him a role in her stage revival of Madam X and reportedly bought him a new wardrobe. Laura Hope Cruz, also significantly older, was another such relationship. These weren't secret. People in those circles knew exactly what was happening. When he finally broke through in Hollywood, the pattern continued. Only now the stage was much bigger. His affair with Joan Crawford became one of the worst-kept secrets in all of Tinseltown. They first appeared together on screen in Dance Fools, Dance in 1931, and what sparked between them off-set was so obvious that MGM executives eventually had to sit both of them down and issue a firm warning: cool it or lose your contracts. They cooled it publicly. Behind closed doors, the affair reportedly stretched on and off across nearly 3 decades. Crawford never publicly confirmed it during Gable's lifetime, but after his death in 1960, she was known to visit his grave and place flowers there quietly, telling those nearby that he was the only man she had ever truly loved. Then there was Loretta Young. The two were cast together in The Call of the Wild in 1935. Young became pregnant. What followed was one of the most elaborate cover-up schemes in Hollywood history. She secretly gave birth to a daughter, Judy Lewis, then placed the baby in an orphanage for 19 months before bringing her home, claiming she had adopted a child. For decades, Young refused to confirm the truth. After Gable's death in 1960, Judy Lewis, then 31 years old, confronted her mother directly and demanded the truth. Young confirmed it privately, telling Lewis that Gable was her father, and according to Lewis, Young said simply, "Yes, you are my sin." Young refused to confirm it publicly for the rest of her life. Her authorized biography, completed before her death in 2000, finally put it on the record, but she stipulated it could not be published until after she was gone. Even during his marriage to Carole Lombard, widely considered the great love of his life, Gable could not stop. Reports of an affair with Lana Turner circulated while they were filming together, and some have speculated that it was Lombard's fear that Gable was with Turner that pushed her to rush home via airplane after a war bond tour in January 1942 rather than take the train. She never made it. The plane crashed into a mountain near Las Vegas, and Lombard was killed. Gable was devastated for the rest of his life. He enlisted in the military, flew combat missions over Europe, and by most accounts was never fully the same man again. He married twice more after Lombard. He also had documented affairs with Grace Kelly on the set of Mogambo in 1953, and by many accounts with Marilyn Monroe while filming The Misfits in 1960. His final film. He died of a heart attack in November of that year, just days after wrapping. 5 marriages, countless affairs, an illegitimate daughter he never publicly claimed. The men and women who worked alongside Gable for decades described him as genuinely charming, deeply insecure, and incapable of being alone. He needed women the way he needed an audience, not out of cruelty, but out of something that looked a lot like a fear of silence. Gable was the king of Hollywood in every complicated sense of the word. Number 10. Errol Flynn. If Clark Gable was the king, Errol Flynn was the pirate who refused to bow to anyone. Flynn was born in Tasmania in 1909, and even as a young man he lived by his own rules, expelled from multiple schools, drifting through New Guinea as a plantation overseer, a newspaper writer, a gambler. He stumbled into acting almost by accident and arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s, looking like the answer to every casting director's prayer. Broad-shouldered, quick-witted, with a smile that made women forget they had any reason to say no. He broke through with Captain Blood in 1935, followed by The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938, which became one of the most beloved adventure films ever made. On screen, Flynn played noble heroes. Off-screen, the story was considerably different. He married the French actress Lily Demita in 1935, but marriage was never really a constraint for Flynn. His Hollywood home on Mulholland Drive became the setting for some of the most notorious parties in the industry, a place where the drinks never stopped, the guests were always beautiful, and Flynn had reportedly installed a two-way mirror system in his bedroom so that he could observe unsuspecting guests. When Confidential magazine exposed the setup in 1955, Flynn initially threatened to sue. He eventually dropped the case. His list of known lovers included Olivia de Havilland, with whom he shared that legendary screen chemistry through 8 films together. De Havilland later confirmed that real feelings were involved, but she kept her distance, aware of what life in Flynn's orbit truly looked like. Marlene Dietrich, who had no shortage of her own experiences with Hollywood's biggest names, once called him Satan's angel. In 1942, Flynn was charged with 2 counts of statutory rape involving teenage girls. He was acquitted, and the spectacle of the trial only seemed to sharpen his public image rather than dim it. The phrase "in like Flynn" became part of the American vernacular, a winking tribute to the man's seemingly boundless success with women. He married 3 times in total. He died in Vancouver in 1959 at the age of 50, his body ravaged by years of alcohol, drugs, and what one journalist who saw him at the end described as the physical deterioration of a man decades older. He had written his autobiography not long before, and he had the audacity to call it My Wicked, Wicked Ways. Nobody who knew him argued with the title. Number 9. Ava Gardner. There is a saying that gets repeated in the old biographies about this era. Ava Gardner was the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. Whether or not that was true, and plenty of people believed it was, what's undeniable is that she lived with an intensity that matched whatever the camera captured. Gardner was born in rural North Carolina in 1922, the youngest of 7 children. She was discovered almost by accident when a photograph of her was spotted in a New York photographer's shop window and sent to MGM. She was tested, signed, and launched into a career that would span decades and earn her an Academy Award nomination for Mogambo in 1953. She married 3 times: Mickey Rooney in 1942, bandleader Artie Shaw in 1945, and Frank Sinatra in 1951. Each marriage was tumultuous in its own right, but her relationships extended far beyond those official unions. Howard Hughes pursued her for years, and the two carried on an on-and-off relationship that by all accounts was equal parts passion and frustration. Hughes was possessive, controlling, and obsessive. Gardner had absolutely no interest in being controlled by anyone. Clark Gable was another name connected to hers during the filming of Mogambo in Africa in 1952. Bullfighter Luis Miguel Dominguin was a significant affair that took place during her years living in Spain in the mid-1950s after she had grown disillusioned with Hollywood and moved to Madrid. But the relationship that defined her publicly and privately was Frank Sinatra. They met in 1945 when Sinatra was still married to his first wife, Nancy. The affair turned into a full-blown scandal, with Sinatra's career temporarily collapsing under the weight of the public backlash. He allegedly attempted suicide on at least one occasion when Gardner briefly left him. They married in 1951, and the 6 years of their union were described by those who witnessed it as one long, spectacular storm, legendary fights, passionate reconciliations, and a kind of destructive devotion that neither of them ever quite replicated with anyone else. They divorced in 1957, and yet they never fully let each other go. In the final years of Gardner's life, after a stroke left her unable to speak easily, the only phone calls she would accept were from Sinatra. He sent her flowers every year. She kept a photograph of the two of them on her bedside table until she died in 1990. Gardner once said plainly that she had never been faithful to any man in her life and had no intention of pretending otherwise. That was simply who she was. She was also, beneath all of it, someone who struggled with the gap between the life she lived publicly and the one she carried privately. She spoke Spanish, loved flamenco, kept no particular schedule, and had a way of making people feel, at least for a while, that they were the only person in the room. That quality followed her into every relationship she had, which partly explains why so many of those relationships refused to fully end. Number 8. Frank Sinatra. Whatever Ava Gardner said about Frank Sinatra, the truth is that the faithlessness ran both ways. Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915, and by the time he was in his mid-20s, he was the most famous singer in America, surrounded by screaming Bobby Soxers who fainted at his concerts. He married his first wife, Nancy Barbado, in 1939, and they had 3 children together. But Sinatra's attitude toward the institution of marriage was, to put it gently, flexible. As his biographer wrote, the more famous Sinatra became, the more women wanted to be near him, and he had no inclination to decline. He was not particularly discreet about it either. The affairs were not hidden so much as ignored, an open arrangement that Nancy tolerated until she couldn't anymore. After Gardner, whom he truly loved in whatever complicated way he was capable of loving anyone, Sinatra married actress Mia Farrow in 1966. He was 50, she was 21. The marriage lasted 2 years, largely because Sinatra refused to delay his filming schedule so that Farrow could complete her role in Rosemary's Baby. He had her served with divorce papers on set. His 4th marriage, to Barbara Marx in 1976, was his longest and final one. But in the years between and during his marriages, the names that appeared in connection with Sinatra were a catalog of mid-century glamour. Lauren Bacall, with whom he had a relationship after Humphrey Bogart's death, Lana Turner, Judy Garland, Kim Novak, and Marilyn Monroe, among many others. Marilyn Monroe deserves particular mention. The two had a relationship in the late 1950s and early 1960s that was complicated by Monroe's proximity to the Kennedy brothers. Sinatra was deeply connected to John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign, hosting fundraisers and organizing star-studded events. Monroe famously performed at Kennedy's birthday celebration at Madison Square Garden in 1962. Sinatra occupied a complicated space at the intersection of Hollywood, Washington politics, and organized crime, and women moved through all of those worlds alongside him. What made Sinatra different from some of the others on this list was the way he compartmentalized. He was capable of genuine warmth, fierce loyalty, and what those close to him described as real love. He was also capable of moving on with startling speed and seeming indifference. His first wife, Nancy, never remarried and spoke of him with affection until the end of her life. She continued to make him pasta on his birthday every year, even after the divorce, and even after everything that had come between them. Whether that says more about her generosity or about Sinatra's hold on people is probably a question without a clean answer. Number 7. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich didn't just refuse to be categorized by the standards of her time. She seemed barely aware those standards existed. Born in Berlin in 1901, Dietrich rose to international fame with The Blue Angel in 1930, and then came to Hollywood under the direction of Josef von Sternberg, who made her into one of the most visually iconic stars of the era. She was glamour in the most architectural sense of the word, constructed, deliberate, and almost entirely self-directed. She married Rudolf Sieber in 1923, and they remained legally married for the rest of his life, despite separating long before. This arrangement suited Dietrich, who moved through relationships with both men and women with what one biographer described as a calm efficiency. She did not see gender as a particularly meaningful filter for desire. Her lovers included a significant portion of Golden Age Hollywood's most prominent male names. Gary Cooper, with whom she had a well-documented affair in the early 1930s. John Wayne, who by his own account fell genuinely in love with her while they were making The Spoilers in 1942, the novelist who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front and who became one of the more serious relationships of her later years. She also had relationships with women at a time when that was not merely scandalous but genuinely dangerous for a career. She and actress Claudette Colbert were linked. So were she and Mercedes D'Acosta, the socialite and writer who had relationships with an extraordinary number of famous women in that era. Dietrich also reportedly had a relationship with Greta Garbo, though both women remained famously guarded about it. She called Errol Flynn Satan's angel, but she said it with the casual certainty of someone who had compared him to a long list of others and arrived at a precise conclusion. During World War II, Dietrich performed tirelessly for Allied troops, becoming one of the most visible entertainers to support the war effort. Remarkable given that she had been born German and had family still in Europe. She considered it a moral obligation and was unambiguous about it. In her later decades, she became increasingly reclusive, spending her final years in a Paris apartment she rarely left. She gave no interviews, took no visitors, and communicated mostly by phone with a small circle of people she trusted. She died in 1992. Her private life, she had always made clear, was her own business, and she kept it that way until the very end. Number 6. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford understood something that very few people of her era were willing to say plainly. She had built herself entirely from scratch, and she was going to live on her own terms. Born Lucille Fay LeSueur in Texas in either 1904 or 1905, even her birth year was contested, Crawford came to Hollywood with nothing and constructed one of the most durable careers in the industry's history. She was under contract at MGM for 18 years, won an Academy Award for Mildred Pierce in 1945, and went on working well into the 1960s and 1970s. Her romantic life was as relentless as her ambition. She married 4 times: Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in 1929, Francho Tone in 1935, Philip Terry in 1942, and Alfred Steele in 1955. Beyond those marriages, the list of men she was involved with was long and overlapped frequently with the biggest names in the business. Clark Gable, as already noted, was the most enduring entanglement, an on and off affair that lasted nearly 30 years and that she described quietly as the central romantic fact of her life. She also had a documented relationship with Spencer Tracy, and with Yul Brynner, and with Marlon Brando, much later in her career, a prominent Hollywood lawyer who was deeply in love with her for years. There were also rumors, some substantiated by those close to her, of relationships with women. Barbara Stanwyck's name appeared in this context with some regularity. Crawford never confirmed or denied with much specificity. What was distinctive about Crawford was her total command of the situation. She was not passive in these relationships. She pursued who she wanted, ended things when she decided to end them, and returned to people when it suited her. In an industry that routinely infantilized even its most powerful female stars, Crawford behaved like someone who had simply declined to receive the memo about acceptable behavior. She was difficult. She was disciplined. She was, by most accounts, genuinely hard to know. She kept a scrupulously clean house, some said obsessively so, and demanded the same level of order and control in every area of her life. But she was also someone who refused, at every stage of her life, to apologize for wanting what she wanted. She kept working well into her 60s, long after most of her contemporaries had faded from the screen, and she took the work seriously every single time. Whatever else could be said about Joan Crawford, nobody ever accused her of not showing up. Number 5. Lana Turner. Lana Turner had a quality on screen that was almost difficult to describe, something luminous and simultaneously fragile, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It drew people to her continuously throughout her life, and she rarely turned away. Turner was born in Wallace, Idaho, in 1921. Legend has it she was discovered at 15 or 16, sitting at the soda fountain counter at a shop on Hollywood Boulevard, though the specific location has been debated over the years. What's certain is that she was signed by MGM quickly, appeared in They Won't Forget in 1937, and by the early 1940s was one of the studio's most bankable stars. She was 17 for most of the filming of Love Finds Andy Hardy, alongside a young Mickey Rooney. She married 8 times. That number alone tells part of the story. Her husbands included bandleader Artie Shaw, who also married Ava Gardner, restaurateur Stephen Crane, actor Lex Barker, and rancher Fred May, among others. But the official marriages were only one layer of a far more complex personal history. Clark Gable was among her early affairs, allegedly carrying on while Gable was married to Carol Lombard. Howard Hughes was another. The list of men who fell in love with Lana Turner in the 1940s and 1950s reads like a directory of Hollywood power. Actors, directors, producers, all of them drawn in by that particular quality she possessed, and, once close to her, finding it nearly impossible to leave cleanly. The episode that brought Turner into the most dramatic headlines was not a romance, but its aftermath. In April 1958, her daughter Cheryl, 14 years old at the time, stabbed Turner's gangster boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, after an argument that escalated into violence. Stompanato died. A coroner's inquest ruled it justifiable homicide. The public was transfixed. Turner's career, remarkably, survived. She made Imitation of Life the following year, in 1959, and it was one of the biggest box office successes of the decade. Turner wrote in her memoirs that love was the thing she had always wanted most, and the thing she could never seem to hold on to for long. Whatever the cause, bad luck, bad choices, the corrosive pressures of fame, the pattern repeated itself with extraordinary consistency across her entire life. She gave interviews into her 70s and remained self-aware enough to acknowledge the wreckage behind her, even as she described it all with the same candor that had made people fall in love with her in the first place. Number 4. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper was, by all outward appearances, the embodiment of quiet American virtue. Tall, lean, soft-spoken, with a kind of weather-beaten integrity that audiences found irresistible. He won 2 Academy Awards, for Sergeant York in 1941 and High Noon in 1952, and was held up in the press and in the public imagination as one of the most wholesome figures in the industry. The reality was somewhat different. Cooper was born in Helena, Montana in 1901, and when he arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1920s, his good looks immediately attracted attention. His relationships began almost as soon as his career did. Clara Bow, the it girl of the silent film era, was an early and notable connection. The two had a highly publicized relationship in 1927 and 1928 before it ended badly. He married Veronica Balfe, known as Rocky, in 1933, and they remained married until his death in 1961. But the marriage was defined by a series of long, serious affairs that Rocky was aware of, and that caused the marriage considerable strain. His affair with Marlene Dietrich in the early 1930s was well known in Hollywood circles. Patricia Neal was 21 when she began a relationship with Cooper on the set of The Fountainhead in 1949. He was 47. The relationship was intense enough that Cooper once reportedly struck Neal after seeing her kiss Kirk Douglas at a party. Rocky issued a forceful ultimatum. The affair ended, though not before it had very nearly destroyed both his marriage and Neal's sense of herself during that period. Grace Kelly came next. The two were linked during the filming of High Noon in 1952, when Cooper was past 50 and Kelly was in her early 20s. She reportedly fell hard. He retreated. The pattern was consistent throughout Cooper's career, an appearance of steady, stoic solidity, and underneath it, a personal life that bore little resemblance to the ranchers and war heroes he played on screen. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1960 and died in May 1961, just weeks after receiving an honorary Academy Award that Jimmy Stewart accepted on his behalf. Stewart wept during the speech, and those who knew the situation said part of what he was crying about was knowing that Cooper was already dying. It was one of the most quietly devastating moments in Oscar ceremony history, a farewell delivered in public on behalf of a man who was already too ill to hear it. Number 3. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth became one of the most photographed women of the Second World War. Her image was so ubiquitous, so deeply embedded in the imagination of the era, that she reportedly said later in life that men fell in love with Gilda and woke up with her. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino in Brooklyn in 1918, she began dancing professionally as a child and was performing in Mexican nightclubs by her early teens. She was signed by Columbia Pictures in the mid-1930s, changed her name, dyed her hair, and through a combination of real talent and a striking physical presence became the studio's biggest star by the early 1940s. She married 5 times. Her first husband, Edward Judson, was a businessman who helped manage her early career, but whom she later described as controlling and domineering. She left him for Orson Welles, whom she married in 1943. Welles was brilliant, charismatic, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity. The marriage produced a daughter, Rebecca, before ending in 1947. Welles later spoke of Hayworth with genuine tenderness, calling her one of the great loves of his life. After Welles came Prince Ali Khan, the son of the Aga Khan and one of the great playboys of the 20th century. A man who, ironically, was himself famous for his way with women. He pursued Hayworth with spectacular persistence, traveling across Europe to be near her, sending flowers and gifts on a scale that impressed even jaded Hollywood observers. They married in 1949 in a lavish ceremony on the French Riviera, and for a time, Hayworth announced she would give up acting entirely to devote herself to their life together. They divorced in 1953. Beyond her marriages, Hayworth's affairs touched many corners of the industry. David Niven, Glenn Ford, with whom she made Gilda in 1946 and who was reportedly deeply in love with her. Howard Hughes, who was connected romantically to seemingly every glamorous woman in Hollywood during the 1940s and 1950s. In her later years, as Alzheimer's disease gradually eroded her memory and her ability to care for herself, the distances of those decades became more apparent. Her daughter Yasmin, from her marriage to Ali Khan, became her caregiver and public advocate in the early years of the disease, when Alzheimer's was still poorly understood and poorly funded. Hayworth's decline helped put a public face on the illness at a time when it needed one. She died in 1987. Those who had known her longest remembered what she had once been, not just the image, but the real woman underneath it. Number 2. Ingrid Bergman. In 1942, when Casablanca was released and audiences first saw Ingrid Bergman turn her face toward the camera in that soft, unforgettable close-up, America decided she was perfect. Not just beautiful, perfect, moral and radiant in a way that seemed to belong to another, better world. That particular image lasted almost exactly 7 years before it shattered publicly in a way that almost ended her career entirely. Bergman was born in Stockholm in 1915 and had already made a number of films in Sweden and Germany before coming to Hollywood in 1939. She worked with some of the most celebrated directors of the era and received enormous critical acclaim. She won her first Academy Award for Gaslight in 1944. While she was making For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943, she began an affair with her co-star, Gary Cooper. Cooper later said that nobody had loved him more intensely than Bergman did during those weeks of filming, and that the day after they wrapped, she wouldn't take his calls. At the time, she was married to Swedish dentist Petter Lindström, and the affair was kept relatively quiet. There had been an earlier entanglement with Spencer Tracy during the production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1941, and later, when she and director Victor Fleming made Joan of Arc in 1948, the two carried on an intense private affair that Fleming's biographer later described as consuming him entirely. Fleming died of a heart attack just months after the film was released, and those close to him believed that the end of that relationship had broken something in him that he never recovered from. What became very public and world-changing in a sense was Roberto Rossellini. In 1949, Bergman wrote a letter to the Italian neo-realist director expressing admiration for his film Rome, Open City. It was professional correspondence that became something else almost immediately. Bergman traveled to Italy to work with Rossellini on Stromboli. She was still married to Lindström. Rossellini was still married to actress Anna Magnani. Bergman became pregnant. The reaction was extraordinary in its intensity. She was denounced on the floor of the United States Senate by Senator Edwin C. Johnson, who called her a powerful influence for evil. The press ran campaigns against her. She was effectively blacklisted from American films for several years. The studio system, which had carefully cultivated her pure image, turned its back on her entirely. Bergman married Rossellini in 1950. They had 3 children together, including the twins Isabella and Isotta. The marriage ended in 1957. She returned to American audiences' good graces gradually, won a second Academy Award for Anastasia in 1956, and eventually a third for Murder on the Orient Express in 1974. She once said, with characteristic directness, that she had never regretted any of it. The love had been real, the consequences had been what they were, and the work had always been there, waiting for her. Number 1. Clara Bow. Before Ava Gardner, before Rita Hayworth, before any of the names on this list had become what they became, there was Clara Bow, the original, the one who proved that fame and desire and scandal could all exist in the same person simultaneously, and that the public would show up anyway. Bow was born in Brooklyn in 1905 into a life of genuine hardship. Her mother suffered from severe mental illness. Her father was largely absent. She was raised in poverty, and by most accounts, she raised herself. She entered a film beauty contest at 16 and won, and from that moment, she moved fast. By the mid-1920s, she was one of the most famous women in America. The 1927 film It defined her image entirely, a word that in the slang of the era meant something like irresistible sexual magnetism, and which Bow possessed in a quantity that the camera seemed to multiply. She made 46 films between 1922 and 1931. The rumors about her personal life were constant, often fabricated, and when real were still spectacular enough on their own. She was linked to Gary Cooper early in both their careers. She had a well-known relationship with actor Victor Fleming, who later directed both Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. There was Eddie Cantor, Bela Lugosi, and a relationship with director Victor Halperin that ended badly and publicly. The gossip went further, and much of it was deliberately malicious, stories planted by people who resented her success or wanted to see the woman from Brooklyn knocked off the pedestal. A former secretary sold a story to the tabloids in 1931, full of claims about wild parties and multiple men, some of which had enough truth in them to be difficult to disprove. What the scandal press never quite captured, what almost no one writing about about Beau in the 1920s captured was the person underneath the image. She was shy and private. She had difficulty sleeping. She was plagued by anxiety that worsened as her fame grew. The image of the flapper, the girl with bobbed hair and painted lips who didn't care what anyone thought, was partly real and partly a construction she wore because it was what the era demanded of her. She retired from film in 1931 at 26, married actor Rex Bell, moved to a ranch in Nevada, and had 2 sons. She spent the rest of her life largely away from public view, struggling with the mental health challenges that had followed her since childhood. She died in 1965. In the brief, incandescent years when she was at the center of everything, Clara Bow had been something truly unprecedented in American culture. A woman who existed entirely on her own terms, who wanted things openly and pursued them without apology, and who paid for that honesty in ways that were not fair and not equal to anything a man in her position would have faced. She was the first. In a lot of ways, everyone else on this list followed in a path she had already walked. And perhaps the saddest part of her story is not the scandal, but the silence that followed it. Decades of a woman living quietly on a Nevada ranch, far from the noise that had once surrounded her, carrying the full weight of an era that had used her image to sell itself, and then moved on when it was done with her. These were 11 men and women who lived their private lives at full volume, in an era that demanded they whisper. Some of them paid for it publicly, some of them never seemed to pay at all. All of them were more complicated than the roles they played, and more human than the mythology that has built up around their names in the decades since. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. There are plenty more stories from the golden age of Hollywood where these came from. See you next time.